This is the face of the man considered by many historians to be the most evil and twisted figure of the Nazi German regime. For in the eyes of Reinhard Heydrich, human life meant nothing at all. Efficiency, opportunism, and the superiority of the German master race were the only currencies he dealt in. But all of the horrors that he would inflict upon the European people would eventually come home to dig his own grave. In one of the great resistance acts of the Second World War, 2 soldiers would end his life one spring day in Prague, in a cloud of smoke and shrapnel. It would prove to be the only successful government-organised assassination of a top Nazi in the entire war, a huge victory for the Czechoslovak people dreaming to be free of Nazi rule. But although it wiped out someone so repulsed by the annals of history, this victory would prove to come at a terrible cost. In today's video we look at the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, the man with the iron heart whose manifestations of misery knew no limits. Why was Reinhard Heydrich considered so evil? Before we come to look at his time in Prague ruling over the Czechoslovak citizens who would eventually end his life, we first need to ask, how did he get there, and why is he considered by some as the worst of all Hitler's deputies? The rise of Heydrich in the Nazi regime had been an unusual one. Hailing from a well-off conservative family, early indications of his beliefs began to emerge after the First World War, when he developed an affinity for Völkisch nationalism, an extreme ideology focusing on German racial superiority that would later become central to Nazi doctrine. Combined with his anger at his family's newly found financial struggles, he would seem a likely candidate to join the Nazi Party. But as they rose steadily throughout the 1920s, the young Heydrich was nowhere to be seen. In fact, his sole interest instead seemed to be in progressing his fledgling naval career. It was only when he was booted out of the Navy for unceremoniously breaking off an engagement with a senior officer's daughter and meeting a woman who was a dedicated National Socialist that the direction of his life started to change. Now looking for a fresh career, his new bride Lena encouraged him to join the Nazi Party, and the turntables of fate started to send Heydrich down a devastating path of mass murder and remorseless cruelty. He joined the party in 1931, rather late for someone who would go on to hold significant power within the regime. After first successfully developing the organisation's intelligence service, the SD, throughout the 1930s he was given other commands within internal security. These included the notorious Gestapo, as well as its parent agency, the Security Police. In 1939, these agencies were all unified into the Reich Security Main Office, with Heydrich as its director. These organisations were broadly responsible for suppressing the Nazis' political opponents, and also of Germany's Jewish population and others deemed inferior by the regime. In fact, the infamous destruction and looting of Jewish businesses that came to be known as Kristallnacht had happened under Heydrich's watch. But it didn't stop there. The murderous Einsatz group and death squads, whose job it was to root out and exterminate millions of these targets in territories conquered during the war, were also under his remit. As horrifying as this all sounds, it doesn't even cover his most infamous crime of all, the one that sits at the heart of his poisonous legacy. For occupying this position is the Wannsee Conference. From a January afternoon in a grand and suburban house in Berlin, Heydrich chaired a meeting that formalised plans for the final solution to the Jewish question, known widely around the world today as the Holocaust. His ruthless efficiency, along with his unquestioning ability to coordinate some of the Nazi regime's darkest crimes, is one of the reasons he was eventually moved to Prague, giving him a fresh opportunity to cast his long and lifeless shadow over the protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Having been established in the wake of Germany's invasion of Czechoslovakia, in the first 2 years of the Protectorate's existence, the man in charge had been one Konstantin von Neurath. But by September 1941, Hitler was becoming concerned that the Czech resistance movement was becoming just a bit too lively, and Neurath was scolded for being too soft on them. Enter Reinhard Heydrich. Named as Neurath's deputy in September 1941, in reality Heydrich was the one who now held all power over the territory. His intentions were clear: Upon arriving in Prague, he told those around him, "We will Germanize the Czech vermin." With resistance activity ongoing, Heydrich's intervention was both swift and brutal. Martial law was declared immediately, thousands of Czech citizens were arrested, and hundreds were executed. Posters of the dead lined the streets to try and suffocate the resistance by fear. Utilising the methods that he had successfully employed in the areas of intelligence, security, and developing mass killing machines, this time Heydrich had to be a bit more restrained. Because the Protectorate's industrial capacity was vital to the German war machine, Heydrich realised that the methods of terror alone would not be enough to solve his problems this time around. Via the National Centre of the Employers' Union, or the NOUZ, Heydrich looked to improve the living standards of Czech workers by raising wages, increasing food rations, and establishing recreational facilities. It was a classic carrot and stick approach, the yin and yang of feigning to improve the lives of citizens whilst committing heinous crimes against anyone who so much as blinked. This approach had Heydrich convinced by 1942 that Prague had been pacified. However, while sat in his suburban mansion awash with arrogance at the apparent success of his work, from London the Czechoslovak government in exile were busy plotting to strike back at the Nazi governor in a colossal act of resistance. Heydrich didn't know it, but his days were numbered. October 2nd, 1941, a red-letter date in both this story and the history of the Second World War. For on this day, the Czechoslovak government in exile set in motion the plan to kill Reinhard Heydrich, known to you and I today as Operation Anthropoid. Anthropoid means resembling a human, rather fitting for someone capable of such rampantly inhuman cruelty. But in spite of Heydrich's liberal bloodletting in the streets of Prague and beyond, it wasn't this alone that spurred the Czechs into action. Over in London, the exiled Czechoslovak president Dr. Edvard Beneš was feeling the heat from his hosts. The Allies had grown frustrated at the relative lack of resistance, and at the ease with which the politicians remaining in Prague had seemed to accept Heydrich's rule. The Czechs also had a motive to try and force the termination of the eternally mocked Munich Agreement. For if Germany were defeated, this would mean the re-establishment of an independent Czechoslovakia, one that would include the Sudetenland territory taken by Germany back in 1938. The frustration of the Allies and a burning hatred of the dark regime that had swallowed their country would only serve as motivation. It was time for the Czechs to bite back. The assassination was to be carried out as quickly as possible. October 28th, 1941 was selected as the date, the anniversary of Czechoslovakia's Independence Day. The two soldiers chosen for the mission were to be parachuted into the Protectorate under the cover of darkness, but in an unfortunate accident during one of the practice jumps, one agent, Karol Svoboda, had to withdraw. Anthropoid was postponed, but now emerged the pairing whose names would go down in history, Jan Kubiš and Jozef Gabčík. The short time frame had perhaps been a little bit optimistic. An additional time was given to train the soldiers and plan the operation. On December 28th, 1941, unknown to the seemingly invincible Heydrich and the hellhounds of his repressive regime, the two men who would shatter his iron grip once and for all were now on their way. As Kubiš and Gabčík parachuted into the snow-covered territory of the Protectorate, Anthropoid was now officially underway. For the next 5 months, the pair hid in Prague with contacts from the local resistance movement. In time, Kubiš and Gabčík learned that Heydrich's daily commute to work included a sharp right-hand turn, where his chauffeur would need to slow to a snail's pace. The perfect spot for a would-be assassin to stop the vehicle. On May 27th, 1942, Kubiš and Gabčík took up their positions. Another soldier by the name of Jozef Valčík spotted the car approaching, and the pair steadied themselves as they prepared to seal the heroic conclusion to the 8-month planning of Anthropoid. But instead, this very nearly descended into an almost comical failure. As he stepped out into the road, Gabčík's submachine gun jammed. Instead of screaming at his driver to flee the scene, Heydrich's pride and arrogance kept him rooted to the spot, and he instead told his driver to stop so that he could fire back at the would-be assassin. It was a decision that would cost Heydrich his life, for he hadn't spotted Kubiš off to one side, who saw his opportunity and lobbed a grenade. Although this didn't land in the car as intended, Kubiš's luck was in. The explosion had resulted in shrapnel flying loose from the vehicle, and the man with the iron heart was now embedded with sharp slices of steel. In his rage, he tried to fire back at the two soldiers, and his chauffeur even took off after Kubiš on foot, but Heydrich could move no longer. Although the two assassins left the scene believing that they had blown it, across town Heydrich was rapidly being scurried to a hospital and fighting for his life. Heinrich Himmler dispatched a squad of the best SS doctors he could find to try and save his colleague's life, but despite early signs of recovery, within a week his condition deteriorated, and by June 4th, 1942, Reinhard Heydrich was no more. But this is not quite where the story ends, for if Heydrich's crimes in the Protectorate were bad in life, then in death they were about to sink deeper than they had ever done before. The actions of Kubiš and Gabčík on that fateful day represented a huge triumph for the Czechoslovak resistance movement and for Operation Anthropoid. They were still under Nazi control, but they had smashed the poisonous stranglehold of a man who embodied the evil of some of the war's worst crimes. Sadly, any celebration would be short-lived, for devastating repercussions were arriving fast. Kubiš and Gabčík went into hiding, but even they would have known that they were by now living on borrowed time. Another Czech resistance fighter named Karel Čerda told the Germans of the assassins' whereabouts, and the two of them were tracked down by the Gestapo to a Prague church. Alongside 5 other resistance fighters, the pair fought valiantly for hours, but the storm of bullets was overwhelming. Kubiš was one of several mortally wounded in the shootout, and those who remained alive, including Gabčík, descended to the church's crypt and took their own lives to avoid capture. The SS had failed their mission to capture either one of the perpetrators alive, only fueling their rage for what was to come. For whilst the likely death of the Anthropoid team is something that the planners would have accounted for, the horrors that would be unleashed on the Czech population was certainly not. Within days, Hitler demanded that 10,000 Czechs be executed at random. Whilst he was eventually convinced otherwise due to the importance of the territory's industry to the war, thousands were nonetheless arrested and murdered. Worst of all was the fate to be suffered by the two villages of Lidice and Ležáky. After Nazi intelligence loosely linked both villages to the Anthropoid team, as well as the wider resistance movement, both were completely destroyed and the majority of their residents murdered, particularly in Ležáky, which left almost no survivors. Lidice was eventually rebuilt after the war via the British-led Lidice Shall Live campaign, but Ležáky never was. Today it stands as a chilling reminder to the wave of death and atrocity that swept over the territory in the merciless month of June 1942. The reprisals, and in particular the destruction of Lidice and Ležáky, disgusted the Allies. In response, they promptly shot down the Munich Agreement and consigned one of the 20th century's most widely slated treaties to the dustbin of history. The path to an independent and sovereign Czechoslovakia had now reopened, and at a tremendous cost, Operation Anthropoid had succeeded. But what of Heydrich? His funeral was naturally used for propaganda purposes, but in private, Hitler was furious at Heydrich's arrogance, blaming his carelessness and lack of adequate security as the reason for his death. But the metaphorical bottle of poison that Heydrich had uncorked over the European continent now had no stopping. The Holocaust that he had been central in planning would now claim millions of lives, whilst his cronies in the Einsatzgruppen, Gestapo and intelligence service all continued to massacre citizens indiscriminately. The long reach of Heydrich's crimes would continue to fuel horror and claim lives right up until the end of the conflict in 1945. Today, the church in Prague still retains the bullet marks from the firefight and features memorials to those who made their last stand in the crypt. For 8 decades later, the names of Jan Kubiš and Jozef Gabčík are forever remembered and intertwined with the story of one of Nazi Germany's most twisted and inhumane figures, the ultimate anthropoid. As always, we hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more from the Assassinations Archive.